When Putin launched his Ukraine invasion, everyone thought that Russia would win easily. The steamroller was coming and Ukraine was right in its path. But over 4 years later, everyone is looking a little stupid. Russia isn't winning. If anything, Putin has already lost the war, and it's all thanks to two things that have destroyed Russia's chances. Ukraine's strategy is one of them. It has done something unprecedented, especially through 2025 and into 2026, that has changed the game. But there's something else, something that caused Putin to lose long before he even started his war. A bombshell has been dropped, and it reveals why Putin has failed so badly in Ukraine. But before we explore that bombshell, here's where the war stands right now and how Ukraine created this situation to discuss. Right now, all of the momentum in Putin's war is in Ukraine's favor. A quick look at the situation on the ground reveals that. Despite launching a massive spring offensive that was supposed to cripple the Donbass and put Russia in a position where it could ask for whatever it wanted at the negotiating table, Ukraine is the nation that is gaining ground. The Institute for the Study of War reveals that May saw Russia steal about 40 square kilometers away from Ukraine, which is already a pitiful return for what is supposed to be a war-ending offensive. But it's made even worse for Russia by the fact that Ukraine liberated 280 square kilometers of its territory during the same month. Something similar happened in April, when Russia took 28 square kilometers but lost 116. We're seeing a turnaround in real time in 2026, but the reality is that Russia hasn't been doing well from the first few weeks of its campaign. Here's a little perspective. That steamrolling campaign that was supposed to cripple Ukraine in February 2022, all that Russia managed to achieve there was occupying 27% of Ukraine's territory, and Ukraine soon mounted a defense so fearsome that Russia was pushed back to 18% by November 2022. It's almost as though Putin was misinformed about how easy Ukraine would be to defeat. How curious. Since November 2022, Russia has spent almost 4 brutal years claiming just another 1.5% of Ukraine, shedding enormous amounts of blood in the process. Ukraine's Ministry of Finance says that Russia has suffered over 1.38 million casualties so far. Putin's thirst for Ukraine and the sacrifices he has forced onto Russia are combining with a low birth rate and higher mortality to the point where it's estimated that Russia's population will shrink by about 300,000 people annually up to 2050, geographical reports. And all of this is to gain territory equivalent to Los Angeles County since November 2022. Something doesn't add up. How has Russia failed so badly when it still has a clear manpower advantage and enough military hardware that Ukraine shouldn't even be able to get out of the blocks? The answer comes down to two things: Ukraine's genius strategy and a bombshell that reveals that Putin has no idea what's really happening and hasn't from the very start of the war. We'll start with the strategy. Since 2025, Ukraine has changed the way that it fights against Russia. In the early years of the war, Ukraine tried to match and overcome Russia on the ground. When Ukraine wanted to liberate territory, it did so by launching ground offensives, as we saw in the summer of 2023, when Ukraine launched a massive counteroffensive that ultimately failed to achieve its goals. That approach played right into Putin's hands, even though Russia was failing to make much progress of its own. He wanted Ukraine to destroy its own military by smashing it against the much larger Russian army. Sure, a lot of Russians would die, but so would plenty of Ukrainians, leading to Russia coming out on top in an attritional war. So Ukraine changed tack. Starting in 2025, the country's focus switched from ground offensives to an asymmetric strategy designed to do two things: cripple the Russian economy and, as Ukraine moved into 2026, take advantage of a new generation of drones to shatter the Russian rear in the occupied territories. On the economic front, long-range strikes that penetrate deeper into Russia than Putin could have ever anticipated have been playing a huge role in ruining Russia's economy. These kinetic sanctions, which go hand in hand with the 26,655 traditional sanctions that Ukraine and its allies have levied against Russia, are doing enormous economic damage, and 2025 was the year when Ukraine committed fully to this strategy. The Economist has the numbers. It says that Ukraine launched 335 strikes that were at least 100 kilometers away from its borders between 2022 and the end of 2024. In 2025, that number rocketed up to 658, almost doubling in 1 year what Ukraine had achieved during the previous 3. And in 2026, assuming that Ukraine maintains its current pace, it will have executed well over 800 deep strikes against Russia, many of which target the oil and gas facilities that Russia relies on to keep money flowing into Putin's war machine. And that is the key. Cut the energy lifeline and Russia's entire economy struggles as a result. The impact of this aspect of Ukraine's asymmetric strategy, particularly in 2026, has been pronounced. On May 12th, the Moscow Times reported that Russia had been forced to cut its forecast for gross domestic product, or GDP, growth from 1.3% down to 0.4%, as Ukraine's strikes racked the country's energy sector. Russia's economy also contracted by 0.3% during the first quarter of 2023, which is a sharp turnaround from the growth that the transformation into a wartime economy had delivered to Russia during the early years of the war. Ukraine can take credit for many of Russia's economic woes, and some are already predicting that Russia has entered the end game in terms of what its economy can do to recover. The Kiel Institute is among them. In a June 11th piece, it said that Russia's wartime economy has reached its limit, as the assets in Russia's liquid sovereign wealth fund have dropped to just 1.8% of GDP in April from 6.5% at the beginning of the invasion. Oil and gas revenues also fell off a cliff during the first quarter of 2026, declining by 45% year-on-year. That's Ukraine's doing. It's hard for Russia to sell oil and gas when its refineries and terminals are burning. These 2026 economic problems are just the start. The reality that Putin faces now is that Russia's economy hasn't been strong at any point during the Ukraine war, even when Russia was claiming growth. The Kremlin claims that Russia's GDP grew by about 13% between 2020 and 2024, before Ukraine's deep strike strategy really took hold. But that may have been a lie, and there's a lot of that going around in Putin's inner circle. According to Sweden's Foreign Minister Maria Malmer Stenergard, an analysis of Russia's nighttime luminosity index suggests that the country's GDP actually contracted by 8% during this time period. This is an interesting way to measure, but it's one with precedent. S&P Global explains that nighttime luminosity is a big economic indicator for several reasons, perhaps the most important for Russia being that they indicate how active supply chain and industry nodes really are. If the lights aren't on, then nobody is making money, at least not as much as Russia was claiming to make. With this context, we see the deep strike aspect of Ukraine's strategy doesn't necessarily create a new problem for Russia. It builds on an issue that has existed since the invasion was launched, and it's only getting worse as more oil burns. We've seen similar lies in terms of Russia's inflation figures. In 2024, Russia claimed that inflation was 10%. That's too high, and it led to Russia's central bank hiking up interest rates to 21%, which is a killer for anybody who needs a loan, be it an individual or a business. But by mid-2026, Russia seemed to be getting a handle on things. Inflation was down to 5.2%, the Kremlin claimed. However, Swedish military intelligence says otherwise, claiming that Russian inflation is closer to 15%, which makes Russia's already weakened capacity for military spending even weaker than it has already become. And not even the closure of the Strait of Hormuz that resulted from Operation Epic Fury has done much to help Russia here. Oil prices may have risen, but Ukraine's deep strike campaign has expanded to the point where it's able to hit the terminals Russia uses to export its oil, often multiple times to shut them down completely. We saw an example of that on June 14th when Ukraine confirmed when it had once again hit Tuap support, from which 20% of Russia's seaborne oil sails. We see all of Russia's economic pain. Ukraine switching to an asymmetric strategy with a heavy emphasis on deep strikes has created so many of the economic challenges that Russia now faces. And if not creating, then Ukraine's long-range drones accentuate problems that already exist. The logic is clear and very simple to follow. Hurt Russia's economy and you cripple its war machine. But that's not all that ingenious strategy boils down to. As Russia itself deals with constant aerial bombardments, Ukraine has been executing the second part of its strategy, which focuses on the occupied territories. Combined, these two tactics are what will lead to Russia losing the war. And remember, there's still the bombshell that put Putin on the back foot from the start. That bombshell changes everything that we thought we knew about the Ukraine war. Before we dig deeper into all of that, this is a reminder that you're watching The Military Show. If you're getting valuable insight from the channel, hit subscribe so you never miss a video. Earlier we told you that Ukraine has moved away from launching large ground campaigns against Russia's forces. However, we also told you that Ukraine has come out ahead in April and May when it comes to territory gained. How is that happening if Ukraine isn't sacrificing large numbers of soldiers to retake that territory? 2 words: mid-range strikes. Throughout 2026, Ukraine has accompanied its intensified deep strike campaign inside Russia with a mid-range strike campaign made possible by the emergence of a new generation of drones that allow Ukraine to hit the Russian rear in occupied territories. Ukraine has spent much of the year using these drones to strike Russian targets in the range of around 50 to 200 kilometers, with May alone seeing Ukraine carry out almost 2,000 such strikes, per President Volodymyr Zelensky. This campaign cripples command posts, air defenses, and troop gatherings behind the lines. And under the logistics lockdown program, which Ukraine officially announced at the end of May, and builds on this mid-range strike campaign, Ukraine has also been taking out record numbers of Russian supply vehicles and fuel trucks, all of which traveled throughout the occupied territories to provide logistical support to soldiers on the front. In May alone, Ukraine's defense forces took out 8,612 Russian vehicles and fuel tanks, on top of its other mid-range strikes. Highways, particularly those feeding into Crimea, are under constant attack, and all of this adds up to a horror situation for Russia. Supplies aren't getting to where they need to be, and that's creating opportunities for Ukraine to launch targeted counterattacks. Rather than the large ground assaults which typified the early years of the war, Ukraine now weakens Russia in the rear before launching flash operations on the ground, which take out the increasingly isolated groups of Russian soldiers that are trying to hold the territory they've stolen. Couple that with Ukraine's lethal defenses, and you get things like 2 consecutive months of Ukraine holding a net territory gain over Russia. Range is everything to Ukraine's strategy against Russia, and it's the one thing that Putin never expected Ukraine to have. Ukraine's long-range strikes penetrate 2.5 times deeper in 2026 than they did in 2022. According to Ukraine's Ministry of Defense in April, that amounts to being able to hit Russian targets consistently at distances up to 1,750 kilometers. That's huge, and it's why Russia is losing so much ground and being embarrassed so heavily on the front. Plus, these strikes aren't all that Ukraine is doing. Russian soldiers still need to be eliminated on the front, and that's what Ukraine's FPV drone-infested kill zones are for. Short-range reconnaissance and strike drones constantly patrol up to 30 kilometers beyond the front lines, on the hunt for Russian soldiers and equipment that are trying to reach the front to launch assaults. It's a recipe for disaster. Take one dash of ruining the Russian economy, add a pinch of mid-range strikes destroying the rear, and combine it with a hefty dose of FPV drone attacks against soldiers on and around the front, and you get a war that Putin is losing. But we said that Putin had lost the war from the start. What we're seeing in 2026 is the culmination of a year-long Ukrainian strategy. But there's still the little matter of the bombshell we've mentioned to address, and that bombshell shows us that Russia's president had lost the war from the start because he had no idea what he was stepping into. We won't keep you waiting any longer. Putin has been lied to for years about almost everything that has anything to do with Russia. It always seemed strange that Putin managed to massively underestimate Ukraine when he launched his invasion. The strength of Ukraine's immediate defense seemed to catch Russia off guard, leading US and European officials to suggest that Putin had been misled about the true strength of Ukraine's military from the start. Those officials didn't know how right they were. On June 15th, United 24 Media and the Moscow Times revealed that Putin lives in an alternative version of reality that is being fed to him by Russian state television. That's according to former Russian propagandist Dmitry Skorobutovy, who claims that Russia's state-owned television stations have been delivering separate off-air news broadcasts that are tailor-made to put a smile on Putin's face since 2011. These broadcasts aren't even what the Russian people see. They are made solely so that Putin sees the good news, whether it exists or not, and completely avoids the bad news that will perhaps give him some idea of how things are really going with his Ukraine invasion. How does Skorobutovy know all of this? He's the former editor-in-chief of the Vesti program on Rossiya 1, so he was directly responsible for pumping what we can unironically call fake news into Putin's eyes and ears. It worked like this, Skorobutovy says of a project that was codenamed The Main Viewer. Let's say a regular Vesti episode aired at 8 p.m, after which the production crew stayed. We were given instructions on what news to keep in that broadcast, what to add, where to embellish things, and what to remove, so that Putin would later be shown the ideal picture of beautiful Russia today. In other words, that he is such a good president. Putin has been isolated from reality in this way for years, the former propagandist says. And suddenly so much of the Ukraine war makes sense. Assuming that this program is still in place, it means that Putin hasn't been seeing any news of Russia's failures in Ukraine, or anything that could upset him, since long before the war began. and it seems that the falsification goes beyond special news programs created for Putin. On May 29th, the new Voice of Ukraine reported that Putin's military commanders are giving Russia's leader false maps that inflate Russia's gains to hide the fact that Russia's offensive has not only slowed, but is actively losing ground. Putin's unwanted confidence about the dominance of Russia is cast into a very different light now. Those demands for the fall of the Donbass by September may not come from arrogance, but from genuinely having no idea how badly Russia is doing in that region right now. When Putin declared that Russia had captured Pokrovsk and Vovchansk at the end of 2025, despite neither city having fallen, he may have been told by commanders that Russia's soldiers had succeeded. Heck, on June 13th, Putin claimed that Russian soldiers can't raise their heads due to Ukraine's drones, as though that was some sort of revelation rather than a reality that existed for years. Is this information that has managed to slip through the carefully woven net of lies around Putin, resulting in him only just figuring out that drones might just be a problem in Ukraine? We can't know for sure, but what we now know is that Russia's president has been operating with a false picture of reality in Ukraine, Russia, and basically everywhere else for years. But now, as even Russia's commanders and propagandists can no longer hide what's happening in Ukraine, Putin might finally be getting a glimpse of the truth. Russia had lost from the start, and Ukraine is driving the knife in. And that leaves Putin scared and desperate. Putin might finally realize that Russia is losing the Ukraine war on multiple fronts. Don't get us wrong, that doesn't mean he is no longer a dangerous man. If anything, that realization could make him more unhinged, as he looks to expand the war that he started beyond Ukraine's borders and into European NATO territory. The humiliation of it all may be too much for Putin to bear, meaning he will reject peace and try to go down swinging, rather than accept the fact that he lost because of Ukraine's brilliance, his own ineptitude, and the lies that were being funneled to him by yes-men for well over a decade. However, this danger comes from desperation, and that means it can't last. As Russia's problems deepen, Ukraine's European allies have opportunities to twist the knife with more sanctions and greater levels of support, which will lead to more pain for the Russian economy and even better results for Ukraine on the battlefield. Mounting Russian losses combined with lackluster volunteer recruitment are already pushing Putin closer to mobilization, which will be a massively unpopular move that could just be the catalyst for his people to finally turn their backs on him. If Putin tries to avoid that, he either has to scale back Russia's military activity, which would be the death of his already faltering invasion, or make greater demands on an economy that he has already flushed down the toilet, creating even more hardship and pain for his people. Putin is running out of options, but the obsession that drives him means that he no longer has any way out. Putin needs Ukraine now more than ever. He promised Russia would claim Ukraine in days. He was wrong. For over 4 years, Russia has been humiliated and beaten down for the world to see, and now Ukraine has the perfect strategy for taking Russia down for good. The steamroller has been turned around. Now it's Putin and Russia that are in the steamroller's path and waiting to be crushed. And outside of negotiating a peace agreement that fails to give Russia anything that Putin promised, Russia's president has no way to escape from a war that he lost without realizing from the moment he launched his invasion. As for Ukraine, it keeps ramping up its strategy, making Russia more desperate than ever before. We mentioned the logistics lockdown program. We saw what that program really meant when Ukraine set up its Armyansk bridge trap and took out 50 Russian vehicles in a matter of minutes. Discover what the mid-range strike campaign really means by watching our video. And if you enjoyed this video, remember to hit subscribe so you can catch what's coming next from The Military Show. And thank you for watching.